I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. It's great to be a part of this really timely and really important multidisciplinary conference today, and I'm delighted to be representing the lovely West of Ireland. I'm going to be speaking about a research project conducted by myself and my colleagues in the School of Education at NUIG Galway in partnership with the National Parent Council Primary. And that was entitled Schooling at Home in Ireland During COVID-19, Perspectives and Experiences of Primary and Second Level Students and Their Parents. Sorry, my slide isn't advancing for some reason.
I think you just need to be on the PowerPoint itself and then it should advance for you. There we go.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so looking at the research aims, I'm glad I didn't do my animation effects. It seems to be a bit incompatible with my Zoom. So we know that the school closures worldwide represented one of the most significant and prolonged disruptions to the daily lives of ever experienced by children and young people. So, you know, we were really interested in looking at the lived experiences of children and young people and parents as they navigated this really novel set of circumstances. And we know that in Ireland, overnight, there was an abrupt transition for children and young people into a new classroom, which was their home. And at the same time, parents were faced with juggling work, if work was still a viable option for them, along with childcare and domestic duties and the new role as teacher of their children, without any preparatory training or without, and probably with varying levels of support. So we wanted to really try and capture and explore these lived experiences. Our study built on some of the really high quality and rapid response studies conducted by our colleagues in other higher education institutions and in other research and advocacy bodies. And we sought to I suppose, really amplify the voices of children and young people through the COVID schooling at home context. And another unique aspect of the research was that it was conducted at a time, namely at the end of the academic year, so it allowed for a reflection on the entire schooling at home period. And I guess at this juncture, I should really just mention that we use the descriptor schooling at home in order to try and capture this completely novel emergency, remote learning, home-based situation, and to differentiate it from homeschooling, because homeschooling is very different in that it typically is a voluntary type of situation. In relation to the research design, which I should mention was an unfunded project, it was a cross-sectional design involving a one-shot online survey, and it was available in both Irish and in English between the period of 17th of June and 10th of August. The primary and the second level school age participants were accessed solely through their parents, and about half of our parent sample provided informed consent for their oldest school age child to participate. And thankfully they managed to cajole their children into completing the survey for us. We used a variety of different recruitment pathways, which are outlined here, but by far the most productive pathway was direct contact with the parents on the parent database of, or on the NPC primary database of parent affiliates. Now, in relation to the achieved sample, we were delighted to attain a final sample of 2,733 parents, but despite our best efforts to diversify the sample, it was ultimately a very homogenous one, being predominantly female, white Irish and relatively affluent. And of course, parents with challenged access to broadband and or parents who don't really engage with social media are probably likely to be underrepresented here. So as you can see in terms of some of the demographics, the majority of the parents were reporting on the experiences of their child in a mainstream primary school of non-JET, which means non-disadvantaged status. And only about 12.7% of parents reported that their oldest child had or was receiving additional learning support due to a special educational need. Turning to the child and the young person sample, it totaled 1,189, 896 of whom were in primary school and 293 were in second level, which is abbreviated to 2L. So again, you can see that most of the children and young people were from mainstream schools, English medium schools of non-JET status, and quite a small proportion were in receipt of additional learning support due to an SEN. So Taking all of these factors into account, and due to the fact that a convenience non-probability sample was used, the representativeness of the findings, I suppose, are questionable. But the experiences and the perspectives articulated by the parents and the children in our final sample are nonetheless valid, and they're very interesting, I suppose, from an idiographic perspective. In relation to the findings, obviously the shortness of this session precludes a really comprehensive overview, but I'd just like to refer you to the full report and the executive summary, which are downloadable through the School of Education website in NUIG Galway. And today I'm just going to focus on two categories of findings, namely perceived quality and quantity of learning, and the experiences and perceived impacts of schooling at home. Okay, so looking at the quantity and quality of learning, first of all, so we found that the average time spent in learning was at schooling at home was 2.2 hours for primary students and 3.6 hours for second level students. So this is actually very similar to the figures that were obtained in Ludger's presentation at the start here in relation to the German context. We found that there was a gender difference here, that boys were spending less time in schooling at home, both at primary level and at second level. I suppose an interesting and a new finding was the perception among students that they actually learned less at home versus school. And we feel that this was probably likely connected to a reduction in academic interest and motivation. So both students and parents were unequivocal in relation to the fact that there was a decline in academic interest and motivation for schooling at home over the period of the closures from March to May and June 2020. And we feel that possibly a contributory factor to this decline in academic interest and motivation was low levels of online live teaching and learning. We found that it was provided for 19% of the primary participants and 58% of the second level participants. Now, in relation to the primary source of support for schooling at home, the classic gendered fallback plan was writ large here in this context. In the majority of households, it was the mother or the female guardian who was the primary facilitator of schooling at home. And in relation to access to technology, we found that while the majority of families and households did have sufficient access or sufficient devices and sufficient internet connectivity, there was a substantial minority of about 27% of families who lacked adequate access to devices, and a smaller minority of about 8 to 12% who reported that they had insufficient broadband connectivity. So these are definite barriers to continuity of learning, because we discovered that the main means through which schools and teachers provided support for schooling at home was through online means, emails, online apps or platforms, and also recommendations for online resources. So turning to the experiences of schooling at home for, first of all, the primary students, enjoyment of schooling at home in general was much higher for primary students relative to second level students. And we didn't find any gender differences in this. So primary school students spoke about enjoying curricular related project work, practical work, physical activities and activities involving technology. They also loved extracurricular, practical indoor and outdoor activities like baking and gardening, and they really relished spending extra time with family members. But the most frequently cited negative attitudes were missing their friends and to a lesser extent their teachers. And they also spoke very strongly about missing school events and rites of passage, such as school tours, communion, confirmation and graduation. And you see that illustrated very nicely in the uppermost quote here. I miss my teacher and I miss my school tour and sports day and the skip-a-thon and the ice cream van and the book sale. In relation to the experiences of schooling at home for post-primary students, again, there was lower levels of enjoyment. There was either variable enjoyment or there was in the main low levels of enjoyment of it. And we saw that second level students, they really struggled with self-motivation and with focus. They spoke about enjoying the freedom of sleeping later in the morning and not having an early school commute, following their own more flexible work schedule as opposed to the really rigid, inflexible schedule of work and after work. They liked being able to self-pace through their schoolwork, and they enjoyed having extra time for extracurricular activities in what they described as a more relaxed home environment. And They enjoyed not having to cope, interestingly, with disruptive students or with bullies in school. But as illustrated by, this uppermost quote, the loss of social interaction and connection with friends was really felt acutely by second level students. And we've discovered that this is a theme across all of the international research we've been exposed to today. And they also reported disliking a lack of communication and support from teachers in the form of live online teaching and learning. And they reported problems, as I said, with the self-motivation and the self-regulation of learning. In terms of some of the assessed impacts of schooling at home, we found the majority of primary and second level parents reported that schooling at home had some minor negative impact rather than no impact at all, or a positive impact on a range of different academic and social emotional outcomes, which were assessed using single Likert scale items. And routine for parents, that was the outcome that was believed to be most adversely affected for their children, whereas independence was the only outcome that they believed was positively impacted by schooling at home. But I should mention that this was only evident within the reports of primary parents. In terms of the young person's views, and these refer to the responses of second level students only, when they were asked about the impact of schooling at home on aspects of their lives, they reported mild negative impacts of schooling at home on all of the assessed outcomes, with the exception of independence. They felt that their independence had developed and improved through the schooling at home experience. And in contrast to parents, they rated their learning as the outcome that was impacted most adversely, rather than their routine. In terms of the open-ended responses around the impacts, parents spoke very, very eloquently about what they perceived to be increased levels of stress and anxiety among their children, including physical and sleep-related manifestations. And some parents spoke about how they actually, for the first time, had to speak, or they had to seek professional mental health support for their children. Another theme that was very prominent in parent reports was isolation and concerns about the loneliness that was triggered by this isolation and the lack of connection and interaction with their peers. Students themselves, in their open-ended responses, they spoke about struggling with adjusting to the situation without the support of their friends and without the daily, social interaction that's inherent in school life. And due to these experiences, there was a really, really strong call among both students and parents about the need for children to return to school full-time for academic and social emotional and for mental health and well-being reasons. Only a small number of parents reported more positive accounts of schooling at home. So some noted that their children benefited from individual support and more family time and more freedom to learn new and different things. In relation to the impacts of schooling at home on parents, I think this was a really striking feature of our research. A key finding was that they were experiencing high levels of role confusion, role conflict, exhaustion, and they described the juggle or the struggle between juggling this new role as a teacher of their children along with the typical childcare and domestic and work-related responsibilities as being exhausting and impossible and unsustainable. And this struggle was particularly intense for parents who were working, or parents who had no childcare, parents of multiple children at different ages, and particularly for parents of children with special educational or additional educational needs. So parents of students with additional educational needs, they spoke about the adverse impact of a lack of routine. They spoke about how it triggered meltdowns and how it was very difficult to support and to focus children in these types of levels of distress with their schooling at home. And it was evident that judgments about failing to adequately support children's academic work during the schooling at home context, it really increased parents' feeling of guilt and stress. So in terms of, just to finish up, if I can have the time, a number of our recommendations, I suppose, are very much grounded in our findings. We feel that it's absolutely essential that schools would remain open during the COVID period, and that would be to protect the academic progress, the social emotional development, the mental health of children and young people, and also the well-being of parents. We feel that that's hugely important, and we want to commend, the amazing dedication and commitment and efforts of all school leaders and teachers to date in reopening the schools and keeping the schools open. But in order for that to continue in a safe and sustainable way, there'll have to be a really creative and determined and coordinated effort at all levels, all systemic levels within education. We also recommend that the government would be involved in developing and issuing much clearer and more detailed guidelines about best practice in relation to remote and blended teaching and learning, because this would ensure equity of access to the curriculum. It would ensure appropriate provision for all students across all schools, and this will require, you know, significant investment in funding and significant training for all principals and teachers in relation to best practice. Now, there was a recent circular release which spoke about the importance of contingency planning for schools, so we really welcome that, but it falls short of providing, I suppose, standardized guidelines for best practice in remote learning and blended teaching and learning. And schools and school leaders, they need an awful lot more training in relation to building their capacity for the use of technology in learning and for meaningful integration of technology with pedagogy for learning. And they need protected time for that learning within that space. And finally, I suppose, with regard to future research, it was a very homogenous sample, unfortunately. We feel it's really important that the lived experience of transition back to school and schooling within the new confined COVID context would be really valuable from the lens of potential marginalised or disadvantaged groups. And actually, myself and Elaine Keane and some other members of the school, of NUIG Galway, are currently involved in exploring this a little bit more in a HRB IRC funded project, which is called Crisis Coping and Marginalised Youth. So we're hoping to really, I suppose, approach this phenomenon from a lens of disadvantage and marginalisation. And we want to look at whether educational inequalities have been compounded and have been increased through both I suppose, the acute period of COVID and also this new continuing confined COVID context. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Niamh. It was a wonderful presentation. Because of the interest of the time, would you mind if take any question through the chat box, Niamh?
Absolutely, that's fine.
And also, would you mind maybe give the if you could type your email address or contact detail, people will be able to reach out to you, if they have any more questions.